ISO works. Our topic for today is how ISO works and its benefits to your organization. A brief about that is that the ability to manage information security has never been more important. The ISO 27001 standard helps an organization to identify its risks and put in place security measures that are right for the business, as well as helping to manage or reduce risk to our information assets. So just a brief about the ISO standard. So in this presentation, we'll then review a bit of the steps of setting up an information security management system and how your organization can capitalize on the structure to realize the growth opportunities and improve stakeholder confidence. Our presenter for today is none other than Mr. Andrew Walusimbi, and I'm proud to be your moderator for this session. A bit about our presenter. Andrew is an information security specialist with 12 years of experience in the banking sector. He's a certified ISO lead implementer with hands-on experience leading and supporting implementation of both ISO 27001 standard and ISO 22301 standard. And he has done this in various countries across Africa, France, and the UK. He's also an executive member of the Cybersecurity Committee under Uganda Bankers Association and a member of the National Information Security Advisory Group, also known as NISAG. And that's not all about our presenter, Andrew, today. He's also currently the head of information security at EcoBank Uganda. At this point, I invite you, Andrew, to take us away. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Emily. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Perfect.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So members who have joined as well, thank you for accepting to join this it's going to be brief. Emily has only given us 45 minutes, so I'll try and cover as much in that time. As Emily introduced rightfully, the risks associated with information security and cyber attacks, they continue to increase both in number, but also in sophistication. And so it has become very apparent and critical for organizations to find a way they can continue to protect the information assets that they keep within their premises, but also as they communicate with the stakeholders, the information that they have, keep and process has to be kept in a very secure manner to avoid any regulatory issues, legal issues. So it has become very apparent that organizations put together a solid information security management system to kind of address the threat to their information. So today we're going to talk about ISO 27001. I'm sure we all know what ISO is, International Standards Organization, and 27001 specifically is a standard that talks about information security. And as we discussed today, you get a good idea of how it works, the benefits of having it in your organization. And I'm assuming we have on the call a few people who might be interested in leading the implementation, maybe even auditing the information security management system. So at the end of this discussion, I want us to all have picked something, from what this standard brings and how we can leverage on its importance or the controls it brings to protect our institutions. So it's an international standard, like I said, provides specifications for an information security management system. It is very systematic in its approach, and those that have had the experience of implementing it will tell you there's a linear way of approaching the implementation, a bit too detailed, but beneficial. So those that intend to go ahead and implement it in their environment should not be surprised at the level of detail required. So it involves people, processes, technology. These three cannot be separated, especially in the corporate environment or in any industry or sector that you work. These three at all times have to intersect. And so information security management system using the ISO 27001 framework kind of helps you safely, but also effectively have these three come together for effective production and productivity in general. So it helps organizations protect the information assets, and it works through a risk management process. So if you're familiar with risk management, you know it's a never-ending activity. You know, you assess the environment, identify risks in that environment, you know, identify the controls that exist in that environment, test the controls. Are they effective? Are they not effective? You know, then you make a decision with the risk owners. So ISO is similar to that. Assess the environment, continually improve the controls that exist in the environment. And the end goal is to really protect the information that you keep so dearly for both your customers, but also for your other stakeholders that are involved in your running of the business. So ISO also helps protect the three. I'm sure we're all familiar with the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability. ISO helps organizations maintain these three at all times, and these are a core concept of information security management. So confidentiality, things to do with information being intact, remaining intact, and only accessible to authorized parties, either within the organization or externally, as the organization sees fit. So the organization wants to make sure that this information is only accessible by people who have authority to do that. Then the integrity part is the information that is kept with the organization, that it's intact, it's accurate, you know, there's no unauthorized alteration, deletion. You want to maintain the integrity of the information you process and keep in your organization. Then ultimately the availability. You know, if the information is confidential and its integrity is intact, if it's not available to the people who need to use it, then kind of breaks our CIA triad. You know, it's like having a fire. If you're putting out fire, you want to remove the oxygen or remove the fuel. If you remember the fundamentals of in our elementary school, how to set up a fire or what conditions that must be in place for a fire to happen. So availability is very important also in the information security management system. So you want to make sure that it's available, readily available to the people
Hello?
that need to use it.
Andrew?
Emily, can you hear
Hello?
me? Yes.
Yes, I can. I'm seeing some comments in the chat about some feedback and buffering. Maybe to maximize resources, perhaps we could first do without the video. I don't know if that could help.
Yes.
Then we can see how that, if it is better. Thank you.
Okay, just a second. Let me.
Okay.
Okay, I think we should be okay.
Let's try that and see. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that. So I was saying that the integrity, availability, and confidentiality of the information has to be maintained at all times, and ISO kind of is designed to help organizations manage their security practices consistently in a cost-effective way. When these three are in interplay at all times, at least you're guaranteed of some consistency, some confidence from the people whose data you keep and process, and ultimately helps you to manage costs within your organization. So ISO exists because it simplifies the standard and standardizes the concepts and ideas of how organizations manage their information security programs. And it's not sector specific. You know, some people say ISO is only for in a corporate setting or in banks, in telecoms. But the way the standard has been designed, it can be applied across the board, regardless of the size of your industry, company, the type of work that you do, the industry, it does not discriminate. And that's the other beauty about ISO 27001. So in a nutshell, this is ISO. You can go out there and try and read more of what it is, the family it comes from, and get a better appreciation of what ISO 27001 really is. So here I've just put an illustration for you to just show you that it's part of a bigger family of the 27000 series. All these are different information security related
Andrew?
ISO. Yes, please.
Apologies for the interruption again. Are you sharing your screen? We can't seem to see your screen with the presentation. You may want to display that. Thank you.
Are you saying all along or just now?
All along, unfortunately. We're only seeing your screen. Kindly share the presentation.
Wow. Okay, just give me a second, please. So if you can see the screen, kindly help me confirm. Is it displaying now?
Yes, it is, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that. Okay, so we talked about what ISO is and how it kind of interplays between the people, technology, and the processes, and how it helps organizations through a risk management kind of process to protect information assets. We have talked about the CIA triad and why it's important for all organizations to have these three intact at all times. And the standard, the ISO standard, helps us to effectively merge these three and have an effective information security management system. I've talked about its applicability regardless of sector, regardless of size of industry, regardless of the product or service you offer to your customers. And we're saying that this standard exists because it simplifies, standardizes the concepts and ideas of how organizations manage their information security programs. So, and here was trying to illustrate to you that ISO 27001 is part of a bigger ISO 27000 series. All these you see here are information security related standards. And we're saying that this series support the information security standard that together globally provide a standard framework or best practice, if you like, for information security management. So there are so many ISO related standards, but the most popular one is the ISO 27001. So maybe also to mention the different frameworks that you may know about different regulations related to information security kind of refer, they have the ISO 27001 standard as a reference point, meaning if an organization decides to take the road to implement the 27001 standard, in effect, they are complying to so many security related standards, including the NIST, and regardless of the region that you operate in, if you're dealing with information security, your reference point should really be around the 27001 standard. So I think that is it about the standard. Like I said, you can expose yourself to different literature about the standard on the internet. We're going to go to the fun stuff now, the actual implementation. The question I get usually is, if this standard is that complex and so deep diving, how is it that organizations manage to implement it anyway? So my task has always been to try and demystify the whole implementation process, but also the fact that it's actually doable. It's not rocket science. And those people that we have on the call today that are not really tech savvy, this is, you shouldn't worry about this standard. There are very few aspects of it that are really technical, meaning someone who is exposed to risk management, the general risk management aspect of business, can easily go into an ISO 27001 implementation or environment and be able to interpret, but also to make a self-assessment of that environment without any challenges. So the standard really takes care of even the non-technical people. So, and I think this is a slide where we are going to spend most of this time. This is the actual implementation plan. I've just put a high level illustration. Of course, in there are detailed steps that you need to follow, or the processes you need to document, but I'll just take you through what you see on the screen. So of course you want to, if your organization determines that they want to have their information security management system streamlined to the ISO standard, they have to show some level of commitment. One, because first of all, they need to let you streamline their processes. You cannot sit in your office and make a decision to start implementing controls in an environment without top management's approval. So you want to do that first, but ultimately they also sign the budgets, they approve the budgets for the control implementation. You may need money to purchase some tools, some gadgets, money to do some training, money to onboard a consultant, if that's the approach you want to take. So obtaining management's commitment and approval is very key before you even do anything. You want to explain to them the benefits that ISO brings, just to get their buy-in. What do they benefit if the environment is streamlined to the ISO international standard, the 27001? Once they're happy with what the benefits will be, then you're halfway your journey. You also want to go in, and after obtaining management's commitment, it's good practice to define your scope. And this is not just for ISO related implementation projects. This is general project management approach. You want to be very clear what your scope is going to be. You can decide to certify or implement the ISO 27001 across the entire organization. You can also choose specific departments, maybe premises for your organization. For example, you can say the operations department deals with a lot of information processing and sharing, and so we're going to certify that department. You can choose the data center, the IT department, and say, okay, these people process a lot of information, and so let us streamline all the controls around information management to the ISO requirements. So the scope can be, it's not static, and the standard is very flexible here, which is a good thing. If you have a huge organization, you can decide to certify the head office, and then incrementally add other premises, through the years. Depends on the approach you want to take. You could also go big bang and say, okay, we have the resources we need, we have the time, we have the competence on board, or maybe we are onboarding a consultant. Let's go all out. Let's certify the whole organization. So as you can imagine, that is a daunting task. It can happen. People have done it. It's very painful, but it's very achievable at the same time. It's very fulfilling. So you've determined the scope, very important. You also want to understand the context of your organization. What kind of services do you offer to the customer? What kind of competition is out there? You also want to understand, are there any legal requirements? Are there any regulatory requirements? Try and understand the concept, the context of your organization. What kind of risks is your organization exposed to because of the nature of the service that you offer to the customer? So having a good appreciation of the context or what your organization really does kind of helps you understand this kind of risks that may affect the operations, and naturally to give you a good guidance on which controls to implement when it comes to the eventual implementation of the controls. So after that, then now that you're understanding the context and you've defined the scope, so you draw a plan together. And the plan can include budgeting, it can include resources, it can include timelines, milestones. This is standard project management. There's no two ways about it. You have to have a plan. Otherwise, you're headed for a very stressful period. So you also want to, meanwhile, the things I'm talking about all need to be documented, because when it comes time to certify, ultimately in the end, the auditors want to see that you have actually documented these things and that they're not just sitting in your head or on your laptop or wherever you kind of work from. So the next thing there is you need to determine what the objectives are going to be for your ISMS, and the overall management system. Are you going to, as you determine the objectives, do you want to improve the security or the resilience of the organization when it comes to information management? Do you want to improve effectiveness? Do you want to reduce downtime related to cyber-related incidents? You have to determine the objectives very, very clearly. Then the next thing there is the policy. Very important that you have a policy. It is almost taboo for you to think about implementing an effective information security management system without having a policy. Why the policy? Because it ensures that your management fully understands the ideal strategy and the benefits behind putting together this ISMS policy, but it also demonstrates some level of commitment on their end, because within that policy, you're kind of assigning responsibilities, from all the way from the board, their commitments, their specific responsibilities when it comes to running an effective information security management system, to the last guy down the line that is implementing a control. So in that policy, you kind of define responsibilities of the ISMS, and also in there you still document the objectives. The objectives can be really technical security controls, but they also can be commercial benefits. If you determine that there's some benefits financially that will come to your organization as a result of implementation of ISMS, then you have to document those in the policy. So it shows some level of commitment. It shows what you intend to achieve, how you intend to achieve, and the kind of support you need to make this happen. So very big thing, and that's why I've delayed on it. Then the risk assessment. You remember when you did your context, understanding the context of your organization, you kind of understood what kind of risks may affect your organization because of the nature of the business that they do. So when you come to the risk assessment part, you're trying to establish which of our internal processes are critical, which of them are mission ending in case they were not effective or in case they were breached. You kind of prioritize which are the critical ones, those that are not very critical, then the list, you kind of do some tiering. And then once you establish that, then you do a risk assessment, try and understand which kind of threats your processes, systems, even manpower could be exposed to, So in that risk assessment, you're not sitting alone doing it, you're engaging with different department heads, you're dealing with stakeholders, people like vendors, service providers, you're dealing with senior management, you're dealing with the technical teams. You're just trying to establish, in case we were hit maybe by a data breach, which processes would be affected most, and is this process critical to the business? Can we afford to have downtime? Can we afford to have it totally shut down? So you do a very detailed risk assessment. You need to make sure that you're looking both internally, what kind of risks might come out internally, what kind of risks may come from outside. You know, things like hackers, competition. Some people might be interested in accessing the kind of information or even data that you keep within your organization. So have a good understanding of where the threats might come from, which aspects of your systems, processes are susceptible to attack. You know, what kind of attack surfaces do you have within your environment, and do a complete, very rigorous process. This one here, I think it takes up most of the implementation process. So once you have a good understanding of the risk assessment, of the risks that your environment is exposed to, and document them, then now you go back to the risk owners where you found these risks. Is it a department? Is it a premises? Is it a unit within your organization? Try and sit down with the representatives or heads or champions of the ISMS from those departments and put together a plan. So these are the risks that were discovered. This is the plan we intend to use to either remediate them or accept the risk, transfer the risk. Those familiar with risk management, you understand how the different ways you can deal with risk. You can either outsource it if there's no way you can do without it. Sometimes you will have to accept the risk, and you're documenting all these things. But basically, find the risk and put together a plan on how you intend to remediate. Now, moving on to the next stage, statement of applicability. It just states, okay, the standard has an annex part of it that has about 114 controls. I haven't talked about the mandatory ones. The mandatory controls are 10 in number. Those you must have if you intend to certify or to have an effective information security management system. But the standard goes ahead, and this talks about how flexible it really is. It has a total of about 114 additional controls. They're not mandatory, but if you read through them and you see that some of those controls apply to your environment, then you document them by way of justifying why you're including them in your information security management system or why you're excluding them. This is a very important step here, because the auditors want to know, why are you excluding these controls? What's the justification? And this is not just your justification as an implementer. This is justification approved by management. As management, they sit together and say, yes, you're correct. We do not need this control because of reasons A, B, C, D, or we must have this control because of these several reasons. And all this must be documented. So for you to understand what is needed within your environment or what is not needed from the annexed A controls, you have to, the easiest way is to ask yourself questions. You can ask yourself, is there a risk that we are trying to manage here? If yes, then definitely you'll need to pick a control specifically that addresses that risk. You also want to ask yourself, do we have a legal requirement to have this control in our environment? Maybe you have some contractual obligations with a third party or a customer, or that has some legal implications. Then you look for a control that addresses that risk. Are there any regulatory requirements? Like we say, the different industries have different regulations. So you want to have a good understanding, and also part of your context, try and understand, is there a regulatory requirement for us to have these set of controls embedded or scoped for our ISMS? So those kinds of questions help you appreciate what to leave out and what to include from the annexed A controls. Then moving on to actual implementation. Now you've established what you need and what you don't need. Now you go in and start implementing the controls. Maybe here I can say most environments that I've experienced, they actually already have some technical controls in place, you know, even before they implement the ISO 27001 standard. So your work now is a bit simplified. You just try and assess the controls that exist. Are they effective? You know, you try and assess them. Are they ineffective? Are they effective? Determine that and then decide, do we maintain this control? Do we improve it based on the business requirements? Do we totally do away with it because maybe it's a cake, you know, it's ancient, it's no longer effective? You make that decision as an implementer, of course, with approval from the senior team, that we need to introduce a new control based on the ISMS, based on the ISO 27001 requirement. So as you all know, when it comes to control implementation, there might be some money required. And that's why it's important that you have management buy-in before you even implement this project. So you may find yourself having to buy new network devices. You may find yourself having to buy new servers. You may find yourself having to employ, you know, competent technical people into your organization just for purposes of closing and making sure some controls are effective within your environment. So you may also find yourself part of implementing this process requiring you to onboard a vendor, a new software, a new monitoring tool, for example. You may need to onboard a consultant just to help you with a specific control within your environment. So the implementation process of the controls is where you now start to use the money you budgeted for in the beginning. So that part also goes like that. Then after doing all these assessments and self-assessment and risk assessments and implementing the controls, it would not make much value. It will not add, you don't realize the benefit of it if you do not have some form of third eye, you know, someone who is not involved in the implementation process or activities itself, someone who has some level of independence to come and look at what you have done, you know, and help you determine whether you're doing it correctly. Are you doing it in line with the standard requirements, or are you just wasting time? You know, you need the internal audit team to come on board. They should be independent. You should not have any of the people assessing your implementation part of the implementation project team. That would be, I don't want to call it suicide, but it's a bit counterproductive. You want to get someone with an independent eye to look at your implementation activity and assess it, you know, give you an honest report. And then you can see whether you need to, you know, first pump the brakes and go back and correct some things or move forward. So the internal auditing process is very, very important. So part of your planning is to have an internal audit plan. Your organization, if they have an internal audit team, that audit team is supposed to have, first of all, a competent person to assess the information security management system based on ISO. You want to assess that they are certified auditors of the ISMS. You don't want to just get an IT auditor and ask them to assess your ISMS. While they might do some things right, they might not do it to the effectiveness of how a certified ISO lead implementer will do the job. And so you want to make sure you have someone with that kind of competence, and they should be able to demonstrate their competence. And you just have to look at their certification, you know, and if they've done some work in the past, that experience is very valuable in this process. So have a plan. The organization internal audit team has to have a documented plan to have an ISMS audit every year or how often they determine to do that. But the plan has to exist, competence has to exist, and these people have to be really independent from the implementation team. Then you can also go into, the next stage is the management review. Very important. You don't want to sit in your office and stress everyone trying to implement controls and not going back to the people that gave you approval to actually implement the standard. So when you talk about management review, it's that process that happens where you share the progress of the implementation with management, the people who gave you a go ahead to implement the process. Go back to them, tell them this is what we have found as ineffective, and this is the plan we have to kind of operationalize this ISMS. These are the challenges we're facing. This is where we need your support. You have to just touch base with them every so often. So management review is very important, because in there you determine whether or not you're meeting the objective that you intended to achieve in the beginning. And so that review must happen. And even the auditors, when they eventually come to assess your environment, they want to ask, they usually ask, have you done any management review? What are the results from that assessment? Are they happy with what's going on? Have they given you the support you need to close the gaps that you picked up? So it's a very important aspect, but also just for continual improvement purposes, you want to periodically update, the stakeholders on how effective the ISMS that you've implemented is, and if there are any challenges, what kind of support they can give you. So that is a very important aspect within the implementation of the ISMS. Then moving to the external audit. Now here you've made a deliberate decision that, now we have implemented these controls, we need to be assessed by an independent external party. And this is sometimes it's a consultant, sometimes it's just an external audit team just to come in before you go in for certification to give you some level of comfort that yes, you've implemented the controls according to the ISO requirement and you're good to go, So they give you that level of confidence to go ahead and apply for the certification. So that is stage one. So this is the second audit effectively happening during this implementation process. Once you pass that stage, then you should be happy. If there are any issues that are picked up, some might be minor non-conformities, some might be just areas that require improvement in terms of controls and their effectiveness. Some might be major, showstoppers. There's some findings that once they are captured during the stage one audit, you cannot proceed. And it only makes sense because, for example, if that external party finds that you do not have an information security policy, that's a major finding. How do you intend to achieve the objectives that you have set out in the beginning? If you cannot demonstrate that, the party stops there. So you have to go back to the drawing board, document a policy, assign responsibilities, define the objectives of what you intend to achieve. So that is just one example of a major finding. If I want to give an example of another major finding that is a showstopper, the risk assessment process. If the auditors find out that you don't have any documented methodology on how you intend to run your risk assessment process, that is definitely a showstopper, because now the question would be, have you identified your critical processes within the organization? If not, how then are you trying to implement an ISMS without understanding what's critical and what's not critical? How can you proceed if you don't even know the risks that are going to impact your ISMS? It's very important that you have a methodology, a risk assessment methodology, and ultimately the plan to fix the issues. So those are some examples of critical showstoppers within the implementation process. So the external auditor will help you clean up, not help you clean up, they'll help you identify these major, minor, and even areas that require improvement. They'll help you do that. They'll give you time. From my experience, they would give us about 3 months, try and clean up, before we can go ahead and apply for certification. So that audit happens. When they pick up things, you clean up, they come again, they assess. So it's very cost effective for you to try and do the best that you can from the beginning, so that you don't have to keep calling on these external auditors, because there's money involved. If you're outsourcing this audit activity to a third party, of course, you're going to have to pay them each time they come to reassess your environment. So you want to get it right the first time, so that when that audit happens, at least there are minor findings that are not showstoppers, so that you don't have to pay for revisits through the months. Then once you are done with that, you've satisfactorily closed everything that has been picked up, then you go ahead and go for stage 2. From stage 1, they recommend you go ahead and apply for the certification audit. Stage 2 is really now the certification body. I'm sure there's so many now. You identify one that has a good reputation, and then bring them on board to do the final assessment. Now, that audit is quite detailed. It's very painful, I must say, but if you have done your work correctly, it's a very smooth process. They're just going to come in and do some sampling. They're going to choose areas to assess, processes to assess. They do some interviews from your different team members. They want to understand, do you appreciate what the ISMS project is trying to achieve? Generally, they go and talk to people who are responsible for implementation of this system, try and find out from them whether they understand what the policy says, they understand their responsibilities during the implementation, and even if when you eventually operationalize the ISMS, they do some sampling here and there. They visit premises, they look at the physical security, they look at the logging system, the monitoring system, they look at how you keep records, both the digital ones and the paper-based records. They look at, they do interviews, random interviews of staff. They could find one in the corridor and just pull them into an interview and try and assess, do these staff members know what the policy is? Do they know what the ISMS is trying to achieve? Do they know what their responsibilities are? So depending on how your staff, especially top management, the people who are signing the checks, the auditor wants to know that they are fully aware of their responsibility and they understand the objectives. And they also need to demonstrate in those interviews that there is some level of commitment. For example, we have a management review as a constant agenda on our monthly or quarterly meetings, management meetings. So that gives them it lends the ISMS some legitimacy at that level. There's commitment from top management, but even beyond, if the auditor can talk to a board person, it gives them that comfort, and so you don't have any issues. So that is just the normal process of the audit. It's very protracted. It's a lot of back and forth, but if you've done your work correctly, ultimately they will recommend you to certify, and that's where you can now, well, the work hasn't stopped, because you have to continually improve your environment through the risk management process. Like I said in the beginning, you have to continually find those gaps, improve the controls. And so the work doesn't stop there. Once you certify, of course, you celebrate, but the work continues. So in a nutshell, this illustration here kind of walks us through the implementation process. It's quite vigorous, it's very engaging, but very possible at the same time. And that's why many institutions are going ahead to implement the ISO 27001 standard in their environment. Maybe also to make mention that it's not mandatory to have this ISMS. You don't have to streamline your controls to the ISMS, to the ISO 27001 standard. It's really not mandatory. But implementing it definitely gives you some benefits, and we're going to talk about those in the next slide. Just to what reasons kind of drive organizations into certifying or implementing the ISO standard in their environment. Yeah, we're just talking about the certification process. I think I've talked about this already. So I was saying the certification board is hired, to conduct the basic review of the ISMS. They review the mandatory documentation. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the implementation process requires a lot of documentation, and that is the main area. Okay, not the main, but one of the main areas the auditors are interested in when they ultimately go ahead and certify you. So you have to correctly document things according to the standard. Don't just document the way you please, what makes it easy for your life, but you have to follow the standard on how to document each process and get these processes approved by management. Those approvals are very important. All the way from procedure, step by step, for example, configuration manuals, process operating manuals, change management, things to do with risk management. The methodology has to be documented, the policy is documented, the scope is documented, everything has to be documented. And I think we would all understand why. Then of course they do an in-depth audit. They perform the certification board, sorry. So we're saying if the auditor is happy with what they see from what you have demonstrated and shared with them, then they will give you a certificate, definitely. The success rate is quite high. You would be surprised. It's very difficult for you to dedicate or deliberately go for this project and you don't certify, unless you really were not serious about it in the beginning. But all the teams that I'm aware of, all the teams I've worked with, the success rate has been 100%. So I don't know if that gives you any motivation, the people intending to go for this certification, but that is the situation. Once you embark on this project, you have to have an end goal of certification. And if you're really serious about it, you definitely will. So after the certification is given to you, the auditors or the certification body will annually come back and try and assess how far off are you from the standard. Have you deviated? Are some controls now not effective? So those annual recertification audits will happen, and you will have to budget for them because they cost some money. So it's just part of that continual improvement that we're talking about. Once they assess, find gaps, then you go back and try and draw a plan how to fix them. And then through the years, your ISMS starts to mature. The people are more aware of their responsibilities, they're more aware of their objectives, and they're all driving and pushing in the same direction. And ultimately, the benefits now starts to come in. You start to realize the benefits. So as part of convincing management to go ahead with this project or to get their approval, their sign off of implementation of this project, you have to tell them what the benefits are going to be. And here I've kind of listed about 8 of them. There could be more. This is what I thought I could share with the people here. You can talk about securing information in all its forms. You remember we talked about the increasing threats to information across the board in all organizations. The threats are increasing, the sophistication is increasing. When you implement an ISMS based on ISO 27001, you can guarantee security of information in all its forms, paper-based, that information you keep on the cloud, the information you keep on the servers, information you share within your networks. There are controls in that standard that help you protect it in transit, in storage, even in creation. As you create this information, you securely do that, only accessible to approved people. Then you can also talk about the increased resilience to cyber attacks. If you effectively implement your ISMS based on the ISO 27001 standard, you can guarantee there is an increased resilience to cyber attacks. Because if you meet all those requirements, clause for clause, you can be sure that your organization's exposure to cyber threats has drastically reduced. And here I'm also going to mention that it's not certifying for ISO does not make your organization airtight, meaning you'll never be attacked. No. What this means is if the event of an attack, if a threat materializes, if an environment is certified and has an effective ISMS running, the chances of the damage being huge is minimized. You know, you can easily isolate an incident, you can easily monitor, detect, and even recover from an incident, because the standard requires that you have all these processes in place of detection, of prevention, general monitoring, but ultimately recovery. So it increases your resilience to cyber attacks. And I think this is a very important point to raise to your stakeholders. Then it also allows for protection of critical information assets. You remember during the risk assessment, we identified what is critical, which information assets are critical for our business. And so what controls must we put in place to ensure protection of these information assets? So the standard also gives you that, so you can guarantee some protection of your information, your critical information assets. Then you can also reduce, it does reduce costs associated with information security. How can I say this? In an structured environment, in an unstructured environment, everything is scattered everywhere, including controls, monitoring systems. There's no connection. And so you find yourself having to buy, 3, 4 different tools to do the same thing. Maybe you have duplicate processes. Maybe you have duplicate controls that are trying to do the same thing. So ISO kind of helps you streamline all these things and saves the organization from spending money on unwanted either solutions, processes, and ultimately helping you reduce costs as an organization. And I thought that's a very good benefit that needs to be articulated, especially to management. Then there's also protection of the CIA. We talked about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, and its importance to have the three working together at all times. So it promotes the CIA within your environment. Then there's embedment. In the security corridors, we keep talking about security by design, security by design. If you have a digital strategy, if you have an organizational digital strategy, make sure it's moving at the same pace with your security strategy. Now, talking about that, the ISMS based on ISO 27001 kind of allows for that to happen. If you have an effective ISMS, information security management system, then that is going to mean that for every process, every project you implement, the security aspects of these processes are catered for in the beginning, even before you start to implement those processes and those projects, which is a good thing. And it helps you achieve the balance between the digital strategy, but also the security strategy. And for effective and good results, you want to have those two moving at the same pace at all times. And ISO 27001 helps you achieve that. Very, very important, especially going forward. You have all had the digital agendas that are happening, especially in the financial services, but also even in the telecom, in health. As institutions are pushing that digital agenda, they're forgetting the security aspect or the information security agenda or strategy. And that's a very, very huge mistake. And it's going to be a huge mistake. It's going to be a downfall of very many softwares, a downfall of very many processes. But the ISO 27001 kind of helps you achieve a balance on how you can move these two together at all times. Then, of course, gives you a competitive edge in the market. There's some sensitive clients who want to know, they need some level of comfort that the environment I'm sharing my information with, does it certify to the international ISO 27001 standard? If your business requires integration with another business, or it's a business to business kind of arrangement, some businesses want to know that the environment or the partner we're bringing on board, are they certified? So that gives them some comfort that the information that they will share with you will be kept intact according to the standard. And so with that, you may achieve a competitive edge in the industry that you work. Then, of course, there is potential reduction in insurance premiums. I don't know if we have any insurance people on the call today, but the idea is if you can prove to the insurance that you have implemented an effective information security management system based on ISO 27001, it creates a negotiating ground, you know, because you're basically telling them we are aware of the risks of our environment, and this is what we have done to kind of lessen the damage if it were to happen. These are the controls we have to detect, monitor, and also recover from any incident. And I think for me, that's a very good negotiating ground when you start to engage with insurance people. So it will lower your insurance premiums. And I think it's a very good aspect to discuss, especially if you're sharing this with your management. So those, for me, are the benefits and again, I've just limited them to 8. If we have time, we can always go over and over the different achievements or different benefits that can result from implementing an ISMS based on ISO 27001. So Emily, I don't know if you're still there. I think this effectively brings us to the end of our presentation. Yes, I think that should be it. So members, thank you very much for taking the time. If you have any questions, now would be a good time to bring them up so we can address them. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so
Was it
so
that
much.
tiring? See you, Sai.
I mean, just excited from all that I've been listening to. Thank you so much. Well, for me, the takeaway has been on the last slide, where we do know that this is something that would then benefit the organization. When you are actually selling such an idea, you would really, the board management would be interested in how all this would actually benefit them. And yeah, I've picked up quite a few. When you're able to basically focus on that, I'm sure we should be able to sell ISO to the executive, and yeah, I think it's something they would consider. Thank you so much, Andrew. At this point, I would go straight on to the questions that we do have. I'll start with one here in the chat before I move to the ones in the Q&A. Someone is asking, Martin, if you can share any tools or a checklist of reviews that can be used to be able to conform with that.
Okay, so am I going to respond to each one, or you want to go through?
Maybe what I could do, let me take on like 3, respond to that, then move on to the other batch.
Let me tackle this question very quickly. Tools, okay. Tools do exist. There are so many you can find on the internet. There's some legitimate vendors out there. You can always find the ones I have are licensed, so you can be sure it's a trick sharing them with any person. So, but I can share with you where to get the tools. There's some I've created for my own use. I don't know if they will do the job for you, but they're a bit high level because I've done this for quite some time. But yes, the official ones licensed, and so I'll just show you where to get them. The other ones that I've created myself, you need to buy me some coffee maybe, and then we see how we can go about that. So yes, the tools do exist.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. So I'll move on to, yes, a question that we do have from Lubaya, who is saying that what is best to start in terms of developing an information security policy and risk management? Should risk management start first so as to act as an input to the policy formulation? Then another person would like you to maybe mention the 10 mandatory controls. Perhaps you could take us through those too.
Okay, you just, is the audio clear now, or should I?
It's fine on my end. Carry on, Andrew. Okay. Thank you.
I won't take any chances. Yes, so the question around what to start with, is that the question? Do you start with the risk management, or risk assessment, or do you start with what was that? Do you start with the policy?
Should risk, I could just take that again. Yeah, the question is, should risk management start first, or shouldn't risk management start first, so as it acts as an input into the policy formulation?
Well, I don't know how to answer this effectively. From my experience, making the policy first is what is pretty much standard. You know, when you're making the policy, you're really just determining the objectives. What do you want to achieve? How do you want to achieve these controls? Who is responsible for what? You have not yet reached that point of actually assessing your environment to determine the risks that your environment is exposed to. However, and again, this depends on the maturity of your organization when it comes to information security management. If you are still in the initial stages, or you're just a starter in this implementation, you want to follow the standard approach. The policy comes first before you do the risk assessment. But as you mature and you do your risk assessment, maybe you will find out some aspects that might have been left out in your policy, and then you embed them. It's really depending on what's comfortable for you. But if you're to follow the standard, you want to start with the security policy before you go into risk management.
Okay. Thank you for that, Andrew. Maybe at a high level, you could mention the 10 mandatory controls.
Okay, just give me a second.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to, hello? I'm going to mention them, not specifically in the order, but I hope you can get them. So number one is context of the organization. You remember we talked about trying to get a good understanding of what products or what services your organization gives. So you want to do that. You want to establish the context of the organization. The other thing you want to do is understand the external parties. You know, are they regulators? Are they other stakeholders? Do some understanding of, are there any regulatory requirements? What are these laws that may affect your ISMS in your environment? So you try and do that. Then also the other mandatory part is the scope. It's very important that you scope what you're trying where you're trying to implement the ISMS. Then of course the policy, very important that you document one and document it according to the standard. Then also you want to have the risk assessment. Risk assessment is very mandatory, and we talked about the risk assessment methodology. In that risk assessment methodology, you're just trying to exploit the different scenarios, risk scenarios that may affect your business. And so you want to also kind of detail the scaling of and weighing of the risks when you identify them in that methodology. So very critical process. You cannot avoid that. Then you also want to have a risk treatment plan for the risks that you've picked up. So the standard talks about that as a mandatory aspect. Then also you want to talk about the statement of applicability. You remember what we talked about, the 114 additional controls in the annexed A of the standard. It's mandatory that you have a documented kind of extract that shows which controls of these 114 that you have identified and accepted that exist in your environment, with justifications of those that you're leaving out and those that you'll be including. So that is very important. Then you have to have an internal audit plan, but also the audit itself. very important. I don't know how many I've listed. I'm just trying to get them off my head. Then, of course, there's the management review. And that management review kind of details the continual improvement. What is your plan to improve the ISMS going forward? So those are the 10. I don't know if they're the ones I've listed for you are 10, but yes, those are the 10 that are mandatory, in addition to those that are not mandatory from the annexed A. So I think that answers that question.
Okay,
Emily,
thank you.
okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. There is another question. Okay, kindly share any templates on ISMS. I think that was also answered.
That was part
then,
of...
yeah, part of what Martin had asked.
Okay.
So I have two questions. What level of risk assessment is done at defining the scope and context of the ISMS? Then I also have another question here, where someone is asking.
Before we bury it in the other thing?
Okay, awesome.
The level of risk assessment is not what determines the scope. You determine the scope before you even do a risk assessment. So you can determine that we are going to have our scope as the data center, for example. You know, before you even do a risk assessment, you have to determine that this is where we will do the risk assessment. So identify, the scoping does not involve the risk assessment. Then the level of risk assessment, again, depending on your maturity as an organization or as the implementer, you can determine, do I do a scenario-based risk assessment, you know, or do I exhaustively list processes within our organization and prioritize them, and therefore use that as an approach for risk assessment? Or do I detail the information assets that we have as an organization and then do a risk assessment on each? Now, depending on what works best for you, you can use these different approaches, and that's how deep you can go when it comes to risk assessment. But the two are the scoping and risk assessment. Maybe someone needs to tell me another way, but from the approach that I've used through the time and also the standard itself, the scope, that's risk assessment does not determine the scope. It's the scope that determines the risk assessment.
Okay, that's sorry about that. Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. So I have one other question from someone who is asking that can ISO 27001 be a framework that an organization can adopt for third-party risk management? Maybe you could just throw some light on that if an organization is to consider adopting the ISO framework for their third-party risk management. Thank you.
Okay, so to respond to that, I hope I got the question correctly. Do they want to first ensure that the third party is ISO certified to onboard them, or just to use that framework to assess the third party's environment? I don't know if that's the question that is really asked.
From the latter.
Yes.
Basically, yeah, how to use the controls to then manage the third party risk.
Okay, so generally there is an information security aspect to do with due diligence of vendors. And I think it's part of those annexed A controls that are not mandatory. But yes, if you're dealing with vendors, it kind of guides you on things to check. You know, do they have some form of resilience on their side? Do they have continuity planning on their end, bringing in the BCM aspect? So yes, you can use the standard very, very well to assess your third party. But it's also good to know that your third party is ISO certified, especially if you're sharing with them information. And you know, suppliers, vendors, solution developers, if they're ISO certified, kind of gives you some level of comfort. So I hope that answers that question.
Well, yeah, I do think it does. Thank you. There's Catherine, your hand is up. You can unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, for that wonderful presentation.
Welcome.
Mine is a clarification. According to your experience,
Yes.
what would be a better way of bringing, say, all staff on board to have quite a smooth interview from the external auditors? As you mentioned, that sometimes it may be random, a staff is moving in the corridor and here they are asked, what is your role? And if they know the policy, what can we do to have all of them on board, that at least they have something they know in terms of policy or otherwise? Do we do awareness or what? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. That's the most scary part for staff. I've experienced during the audit that they keep dodging the auditors in the corridor because they fear to be pulled in for interviews. But there are a couple of things you can do. Number one, you want to create some form of ownership. You don't want this ISO implementation project to be on your head as an implementer. You want to kind of assign, delegate some of the activities to create some form of ownership from the staff's perspective. But you rightly say awareness is very important. You know, you don't have to go into the technical aspects of the implementation, but you can just give them a brief description of what ISO is about, you know, what you're trying to achieve as an organization, what their responsibilities are when it comes to running an effective information security management system, and try and simplify these things to digestible bits so that they can have it in their heads. That this is not just a checkbox kind of activity, a one-off project. This is a culture that we're trying to implement here in this organization. And this is what is going to be your responsibility going forward. These are some of the things that you need to look out for. You can also assign them to be champions in their different units and departments to look at things to do with protection of information. You know, don't leave records unclassified and leave them just lying around. Physical access control, how they can manage or monitor their access within the building, within the premises, their understanding of privilege or information classifications. You can choose an aspect of information security that you feel the staff need to be responsible for, and educate them about it and give them the entire picture of how these small activities kind of fit into the bigger ISO 27001 implementation. So it will give them some level of comfort, number one, when the auditor asks, but it will also help them understand what you're trying to achieve. The number one thing you want to avoid is implementing this project yourself, because you may successfully do it very painfully, but it helps to have everyone on board pushing in the same direction. And during that awareness, you kind of create that ownership. It shows up in the audit to your advantage, but it also helps you smoothly run the system in the coming periods. So yes, the awareness is very important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I'll just take another scroll through the Q&A just to be sure we do not have anything there. Okay, I think it looks awesome. Yeah, we do not seem to have any questions in there. I just see compliments in the chat. Yes, the attendees are grateful, and I'm sure we've all picked up a lot. We can all describe what an ISMS is, and also ably talk about the controls that we do have in there and how we can actually sell this to our management. Yes, so thank you so much, Andrew, for
Emily,
your time. Yes, please.
Let me just interject small.
Okay.
You remember I talked about this standard not being mandatory, and that organizations choose based on the benefits that are articulated to them. I just wanted to say that in different regions, across the world, different regulators are now making ISO 27001 mandatory, for organizations, especially those that are trying to, that process data processes, financial institutions, of course, telecoms, health. They're making it mandatory for these organizations to certify to ISO. And so for me, I see an opportunity here. I know we're a bit late to the party, but there are some discussions in the corridors, the regulator corridors, talking about having this as a mandatory requirement locally here. And so members on the call interested in this, there's an opportunity professionally, but also an opportunity for the organizations to get their act together when it comes to streamlining their information security management systems. So yes, I just thought I should mention that.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for that addition on all the information that we've gladly received and ingested. I'm sure we shall all go back and have things to ponder about while we are at it. Maybe at this point, maybe you could just give us your parting shots as I then close the session, since we're already 22 hours into our scheduled ending time. Thank you.
Sorry, my parting shots were actually that comment I made about the standard being made mandatory. Maybe what I can also say is some organizations have decided to do a hybrid, picked part of the NIST framework, picked part of COBIT framework, picked part of ISO. They just pick elements within those different frameworks and standards that work for their environment. So since the standard is not mandatory, if your intention is to really help your organization protect information assets, as a security professional, you can pick and choose for them, of course, with reference to your colleagues and senior management on what will effectively help you achieve that kind of environment that is protected. You can pick and choose which aspects of these different frameworks work for you. But just keep in mind that all these different frameworks ultimately refer to ISO 27001, so you might as well just go for it. So I think for parting shots, I think for me, that would be it.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, yeah, we are very grateful as a chapter for putting off your time to share this valuable information with our members. At this point, I would like to recognize the presence of the board members that we do have on the call. Thank you so much. And most especially, a big thank you to you, our members, who have taken time to join in. As we close, I would just like to inform us of our annual general meeting that is scheduled to take place on the 10th of December. And more information on that will be gotten from the emails and our social media platforms. And I would also just like to encourage you to follow us on our socials to get more information about what's happening in the chapter, but also ISACA at that global level. Then for those who are yet to renew their membership, there's also an opportunity to do that. And for the new members, when you join now, your membership is valid until 2023. So it's a good time to actually join ISACA. So thank you very much, everyone. And without further ado, I would just like to say a goodbye and see you at our next session. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Emily.
You're welcome. Bye.
Okay.